Before you drift into the quiet arms of sleep, allow me to ask you a question. How does a simple boy, one who can barely scratch his name into the dirt, grow to walk in the shadow of a man who would conquer a kingdom? This journey sounds like a fairy tale, but in the iron and blood reality of the Middle Ages, it was a story waiting to unfold. Our tale doesn't begin on a gilded throne, but rather on a humble straw mattress, inside a small, dimly lit cottage with rough-hewn stone walls. This is where we find him, Aelric. The air he breathes is cool and heavy, thick with the familiar sense of wood smoke, damp earth, and the faint, ever-present hint of livestock. The only sound is the soft crackle of a dying ember in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows that twist and climb the walls like restless spirits. He wakes not to a feeling of disorientation, but to the crushing weight of familiarity. He knows, with a certainty that settles deep in his bones, that another day of toil awaits him. For somehow, through no twist of fate or fanciful dream, he has found himself born into the life of a peasant farmer in medieval England, one of the great silent mass of humanity that labored from dawn until dusk to coax a meager living from the unforgiving soil. But fear not, dear listener, for his story is not a nightmare, but an opportunity we shall witness together. An opportunity to experience a different way of life, to walk in the humble footsteps of a boy who will stand at the precipice of history, all from the deep comfort and profound safety of your own bed. So take a deep, calming breath. Let your body relax completely into your mattress, and allow your mind to drift back through the centuries, to a time of looming castles and soaring cathedrals, of whispered chivalry and silent plague, of unwavering faith and even greater, more terrifying change. Our journey begins in the heart of the English countryside, in a small village not unlike the countless others that dotted the landscape. Here, life revolves around the unyielding rhythms of the land, the turning of the seasons, the rising and setting of the sun, the endless, back-breaking cycle of planting and harvest. Aelric's day begins long before the first hint of dawn, as he is stirred from his straw bed by the crow of a rooster, a sound that has echoed, unchanged, across the ages. He dresses simply, pulling on a rough-spun tunic and breeches, perhaps adding a threadbare woolen cloak to ward off the persistent morning chill. His first task, as always, is to tend to the animals. He feeds the few chickens that peck anxiously around his feet, his movements slow and practiced. He milks the family's goat, whose precious sustenance is a bulwark against hunger, and then he must face the great, weary ox that will be his companion in the fields. As Aelric moves through these morning chores, take a moment to breathe with him, to truly sense this simple, rustic existence. Inhale the earthy musk of the animals, the sweet, sharp scent of the hay, the cool dampness of the earth beneath his worn leather shoes. These are the smells of a life lived intimately with the land, a life of relentless work, yes, but also one of simple, fleeting pleasures. With the animals tended to, he returns to the small, one-room cottage where his family is just beginning to stir. Together, they break their fast with a plain meal of barley porridge and bread that has already grown stale, washed down with a cup of weak, watery ale. The flavors are not meant for enjoyment, but for function. They are fuel for the long, arduous day of labor that lies ahead. As the sun finally crests the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold, Aelric sets out for the fields, ready to begin the strenuous labor that is the lot of the medieval peasant. With his ox and a heavy wooden plow, he turns the rich, dark earth, preparing it for the planting of the essential crops: wheat and barley, rye and oats, These are the staples that must feed his family through the long, unforgiving winter months. The work is hard, the days achingly long. He feels the sun beating down on his back, the sweat trickling down his face, the deep, familiar ache in his muscles as he pushes himself to keep pace with the slow, steady turning of the plow. Yet, even in this exhaustive labor, there is a certain grim satisfaction, a sense of his purpose and his unchangeable place in the grand scheme of things. As a peasant, Aelric knows his life is not truly his own. He is bound to the land and, by extension, to the local lord who owns it. He is obligated to work the Lord's fields and surrender a hefty portion of his own harvest in exchange for a promise of protection. It is a simple, unbreakable arrangement, one that defines the lives of millions across medieval Europe. But even within this humble, constrained existence, there is room for dreams, for a spark of ambition that refuses to be extinguished. As Aelric works the fields, his mind often drifts. He watches his younger brother, a carefree child, running between the furrows, laughing as he chases a butterfly or plays at sword fighting with a fallen branch. Aelric feels a pang of something he cannot name, a mixture of love and a deep, unsettling jealousy for the boy's innocence. It is in these moments of quiet rebellion that the seed of change finds fertile ground. Today, however, his thoughts are darker. A shadow has fallen over the village. The Lord's tax collector, a man known for his cruel temperament and heavy hand, is due to arrive. The mere thought of his visit sours the air, adding a layer of dread to the day's labor. This tax collector isn't just a functionary. He is a physical embodiment of the oppressive hierarchy, a constant, painful reminder of their powerlessness. Aelric grips the handle of his plow tighter, his knuckles white. He does not yet know it, but this impending confrontation, this small, personal injustice, will be the catalyst that sets his feet on an entirely new and unimaginable path. A path that leads far beyond the confines of these familiar fields. The tax collector arrived like a foul storm, his horse trampling the village's meager vegetable patches. He was a barrel-chested man whose cruelty was a form of currency, and he extracted his due with threats and shoves. Aelric watched, his hands clenched in powerless fury, as the man snatched an extra measure of grain from his family's winter stores, enough to mean the difference between hunger and survival. The injustice burned hot in his chest. That evening, seeking refuge from the suffocating silence of his home, Aelric ventured deep into the woods, a place of both solace and whispered dangers. It was there, in a sun-dappled clearing, that his destiny shifted. He stumbled upon a small hunting party, nobles by their fine clothes and proud bearing. One of them, a young man with an intense, unwavering gaze and a palpable air of authority, was tending to his horse. A brief, violent skirmish with a cornered wild boar left the young noble in a precarious spot. Acting on pure instinct, Aelric used his wood axe to distract the beast, giving the man the moment he needed. The young noble, whose name was William, saw not a peasant, but a boy with a flicker of defiance in his eyes. Though born into a lowly station himself and orphaned at a young age, William's own life had taken a remarkable turn when a powerful lord recognized his potential and made him his squire. It was a rare, almost impossible opportunity, a chance to escape the life of toil that was the fate of most. Now, seeing a similar spark in Aelric, he offered not praise, but a curt nod and a small, strangely carved wooden token. "If the world ever becomes too small for you here," William said, his French-accented words clipped and strange to Aelric's ears, "find your way across the water. A boy with courage can be of use. With that, the party was gone, leaving Aelric with a pounding heart and a token that felt heavier than any stone. That token became his secret obsession, a tangible link to a world beyond his own. He knew then that he could not stay. William, for his part, seized his own chance with both hands. He was a quick study, voraciously absorbing the arts of horsemanship and swordsmanship, the complex dance of courtly etiquette, and the brutal logic of military strategy. He grew into a formidable young man, tall and strong, with a mind as sharp as his blade and a natural air of command that made others unconsciously bend to his will. His immense talents did not go unnoticed. William soon caught the eye of the powerful Duke of Normandy, a man who recognized in him a kindred spirit, someone driven by ambition and cunning, a valuable ally in a world of shifting loyalties. The Duke took William under his wing, eventually knighting him and granting him lands and titles of his own. It was a dizzying, unprecedented rise for someone of his background, but William was only just getting started. He had his sights set on an even greater prize, a conquest that seemed impossible to all but him, the English throne itself. Months later, after a tearful farewell to a family that could not understand his madness, Aelric made his own journey. He traded his family's last good axe for passage on a fishing boat, surviving a sickening journey across the English Channel. He arrived in Normandy, a land that felt alien in its language, its food, its very air. Clutching the wooden token, he spent weeks working odd jobs, sleeping in alleys, until he finally found his way to the Duke's court. Presenting the token to a guard, he was, to his astonishment, granted entry. He was brought before William, who was now a powerful lord in his own right. William barely remembered the boy from the forest, but he remembered the act. Amused by Aelric's audacity, and perhaps seeing a flicker of his own relentless drive in the boy's desperate eyes, he gave him a place, not as a squire, but as the lowest stable hand. And so began Aelric's new life. He was a shadow in the great machine of William's ambition. His days were spent mucking out stalls and tending to war horses, but his eyes and ears were wide open. He watched William's relentless preparations. Through a masterful combination of political maneuvering, strategic alliances, and outright ruthlessness, William positioned himself as a legitimate claimant to the English crown. Aelric heard the whispers in the courtyard, the rumors of pacts made and broken. He saw the endless drills of the knights, the stockpiling of weapons, the construction of a vast fleet of ships. He was witnessing the forging of a war machine. And when the news finally came that the old English king had died without a clear heir, a palpable tension gripped the entire castle. William seized his chance. On a cool autumn day in 1066, Aelric found himself on one of those ships, not as a warrior, but as a terrified stable boy, part of a vast army setting sail across the channel, ready to stake a claim for a lord he barely knew with blood and with iron. The shores of his homeland awaited, not as a comforting sight, but as a target. Aelric's invasion force landed on the southern coast of England, a place he recognized with a sickening lurch in his stomach. This was his home, yet he was now among its invaders. The stage was set for one of the most consequential battles in medieval history, the Battle of Hastings. On a field near the small coastal village, the two armies clashed in a desperate, brutal struggle for the fate of a nation. Aelric, tasked with carrying water and aiding the farriers behind the lines, had a terrifying, panoramic view of the unfolding chaos. The English, led by their new king Harold Godwin's son, were formidable foes. They were fierce warriors, fighting with the desperate strength of men defending their homeland from a foreign threat. At the crest of the hill, they formed an impenetrable shield wall, their kite shields locked together, their battle axes and long spears bristling like the quills of some great, monstrous hedgehog. It seemed to Aelric an unbreakable wall of pure English defiance. For hours the battle raged. The Norman cavalry, a terrifying force of armored men on massive war horses, charged the English line again and again, only to be repelled each time. The sound was a deafening symphony of destruction. The thunder of hooves, the splintering of wood as lances shattered against shields, the sharp, metallic ring of sword against helmet, and underneath it all, the unending chorus of men screaming in rage and agony. Aelric watched, his body trembling, as men he might have known, men who spoke his language, held firm against the onslaught. He saw the cunning of his new lord, William, a commander who seemed to thrive in the heart of this chaos. But as the day wore on, with the Norman attacks proving fruitless, a sense of frustration began to ripple through the invading army. Aelric could feel it, a palpable wave of doubt. It was then that William, a cunning commander with a trick up his sleeve, unleashed his devastating tactic. He ordered his cavalry to feign a retreat, a move of incredible discipline and risk. The English, sensing victory, roared in triumph and broke their defensive formation, charging down the hill in a disorganized wave. It was a fatal error. When the moment was precisely right, William wheeled his horsemen around and charged with renewed fury, smashing into the now exposed English flanks. The disciplined retreat had become a deadly trap. It was a devastating, brilliant maneuver, and it decisively turned the tide of the battle. The impenetrable shield wall was shattered, and the fight devolved into a series of frantic, bloody skirmishes across the field. Amidst the chaos, Aelric saw a familiar face, the tax collector, his eyes wide with terror, cut down by a Norman sword. There was no justice in it, no satisfaction, only the grim, impartial reality of war. By the day's end, the field was a horrific tapestry of the slain, and the English army was in a full, desperate retreat. King Harold himself was dead, struck down, as the stories would later tell, by a stray arrow to the eye. William, the Duke of Normandy, stood victorious, the crown of England now firmly within his grasp. The sight of the blood-soaked field, the sheer scale of the death, would haunt Aelric for the rest of his life. On Christmas Day, 1066, Aelric stood in the crowd outside Westminster Abbey, a forgotten face among thousands, and heard the cheers as William was crowned king, ushering in a new era of Norman rule that would transform the country forever. The Norman Conquest, as it came to be known, was a watershed moment in English history, a deep, painful cut that would reshape the nation. The changes came swiftly, sweeping shifts to the language, culture, and power structures of the nation began almost immediately. French became the language of the new court and the nobility, a constant reminder of who was now in power, while English, Aelric's own tongue, was relegated to the speech of the common, conquered folk. The old Anglo-Saxon aristocracy was systematically uprooted and replaced by William's loyal Norman barons, who were granted vast tracts of land to secure their allegiance and solidify the new regime. These barons wasted no time in asserting their newfound power and prestige. Across the countryside, the very landscape began to change. The Normans embarked on a massive, unprecedented program of castle building. Aelric, now a servant to a minor Norman knight who had been granted a small plot of land, was put to work on one of the first. Motte and Bailey castles, as they were called, sprung up like wooden mushrooms after a heavy rain. They were crude but effective. Great earthen mounds, the motte, topped with wooden keeps, surrounded by deep, muddy ditches and sturdy wooden palisades, the Bailey. These early castles were built more for brutal function than for form, designed to intimidate and control the local populace. Aelric labored, hauling timber and digging ditches, building the very structures that cemented his people's subjugation. His heart a confusing mix of resentment, fear, and a grudging awe for the sheer will of his conquerors. Years began to blur into one another, each marked by the turning of the seasons and the slow, inexorable tightening of the Norman grip on England. The crude wooden keep where Aelric served his new lord was eventually torn down. As Norman rule became more entrenched and their wealth grew, wood gave way to stone. Aelric, who had risen from stable hand to a trusted steward overseeing local labor, watched this transformation with a mix of awe and trepidation. He spent years breathing in stone dust as masons from Normandy and beyond shaped the massive blocks that would form the classic medieval castle of legend. He saw the towering keep rise, a defiant finger of stone pointing at the heavens. He walked the foundations of thick curtain walls, watched as soaring towers were erected at their corners, complete with crenellated battlements that looked like a stone crown against the sky. Finally, a wide, deep moat was dug, encircling the entire fortress, making it an island of pure, unassailable power. For the Norman elite, these magnificent castles were far more than just military strongholds. They were potent symbols of wealth, permanence, and their absolute dominance over the conquered English. Within these newly erected stone walls, Aelric witnessed a life he could scarcely have imagined in his youth. The great lords and ladies played out the complex rituals and whispered intrigues of courtly life. He would stand in the shadows of the great hall during sumptuous feasts, clearing away trenchers of bread soaked in gravy while the nobility dined on roasted swan and spiced wines. He would hear the music of minstrels and the bawdy jokes of jesters echoing through the vaulted space as alliances were forged and broken over cups of Hippocras. This was a world of performance, where every gesture and every word was weighed with political significance. But life in a medieval castle was not all pomp and pleasure. It was a bustling, self-contained hive of industry and ceaseless activity, a small, fortified town unto itself. Aelric's duties as steward took him through every part of it. Down in the Bailey, the enclosed courtyard at the foot of the castle, the blacksmith's forge glowed red-hot from dawn till dusk, the rhythmic clang of his hammer shaping iron into swords, armor, and horseshoes. He would pass the Fletchers, who sat patiently in the sun, carefully crafting arrows and bowstrings, their work silent but deadly. He oversaw the stores, the granaries, and the armories, keeping meticulous count of every resource. The courtyard was a constant cacophony of sound and motion. Men-at-arms trained relentlessly, the clash of their practiced swords ringing off the stone walls, their shouts echoing in the crisp air. And in times of trouble, a local uprising or a rumor of war, the castle became a true refuge, a place of safety for noble and commoner alike. The drawbridge would be raised with a groan of chains, the heavy iron portcullis lowered with a deafening thud, and the great oaken gates swung shut, sealing the castle and its inhabitants off from the very real dangers of the outside world. Yet, the castle was not the only bastion of power and authority looming over the medieval landscape. Equally impressive, and in some ways even more influential, were the great cathedrals and monasteries that began to scar the countryside with their soaring monuments to the might and grandeur of the Catholic Church. In an age where faith was the absolute cornerstone of daily life, the Church wielded immense, almost unimaginable power. Aelric felt this power not just in the imposing architecture, but in the very fabric of his new life. The Church was the guardian of all learning and knowledge, the ultimate arbiter of morality and justice, the one and only gateway to salvation and eternal life. To be in the good graces of the Church was to be in the good graces of God Himself. To be condemned by it was a fate worse than death. The powerful abbots and bishops were often as deeply involved in worldly affairs as any secular lord. They engaged in high politics and diplomacy, and Aelric had even seen his own lord, a proud and fearsome warrior, bow his head in deference to a visiting bishop. The line between spiritual and temporal power was not just blurred. At times, it seemed not to exist at all. The constant, simmering struggle for supremacy between church and state was a deep undercurrent of medieval life, a silent war waged for the very soul of the kingdom. In the years that Aelric served as steward, watching the stone castle rise and his lord's power solidify, a new kind of fever began to sweep across Christendom, a fever that had nothing to do with sickness. It was a spiritual fervor, a holy mandate that would soon drain the land of its men and money. Nowhere was this struggle for supremacy between church and state more evident, more dramatic, than in the great and terrible enterprise of the Crusades. In the year 1095, a new call to arms was issued by Pope Urban II, a summons that echoed from the grandest cathedrals to the humblest parish churches. Aelric heard it himself from a traveling priest, his voice thundering from a makeshift pulpit in the village square. The priest spoke of freeing Jerusalem and the Holy Land from Muslim rule, urging the knights and fighting men of Europe to take up the cross and embark on a holy mission. For the crusading knights, it was presented as a profound chance for both glory and salvation, a divine opportunity to prove their valor and piety on the field of battle, with the promise of eternal reward for their sacrifice. Aelric watched as his own lord and several of his knights answered the call. He saw them in the castle chapel, kneeling as the priest blessed their swords. He watched their wives and mothers sew the sign of the cross onto their surcoats and shields, a stark, red symbol of their holy vow. Then they were gone, a column of shining armor and fluttering banners riding east, leaving behind their homes, their lands, and their families for the promise of a martyr's crown. For those left behind, like Aelric, life became a long, anxious wait. The years passed slowly. News was scarce, carried by the occasional pilgrim or merchant returning from the east with fragmented, often terrifying tales. The journey to the Holy Land, they learned, was long and perilous, a grueling trek through hostile lands and across treacherous seas. Many never made it, falling victim to disease, starvation, or the swords of the enemy long before they ever saw the hallowed walls of Jerusalem. Many years later, one of the knights who had left with his lord returned, a man broken in body and spirit. He was all that was left of the original party. In the evenings, by the light of the great hall's fire, he would tell his stories, not of glory, but of horror. He spoke of the brutal siege of the Holy City in 1099, a battle that left the ancient streets running red with the blood of the slain, its Muslim and Jewish inhabitants slaughtered indiscriminately. He described the Christian kingdoms they established in the Levant, fragile outposts in a hostile land, and the constant, bloody struggle to hold this distant territory against a determined and resilient Muslim foe. He spoke of more crusades that followed over the next 2 centuries, each one seeking to shore up the fragile gains of the last. For the people of the Holy Land, caught between the warring factions, the Crusades were a time of unimaginable suffering and upheaval. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, and innocent lives were lost in the crossfire of holy war. The knights' stories were not of a noble ideal, but of a brutal reality that had sown seeds of enmity between Christians and Muslims, seeds that would take root and grow, bearing bitter fruit for generations to come. Yet, as the returning knight also brought to light, the Crusades had unintended consequences. They had exposed the Europeans to the immense riches and startling sophistication of the East. The knight had brought back with him not just scars, but a small pouch of exotic spices that transformed the Lord's table, a bolt of shimmering silk that was unlike any fabric Aelric had ever touched, and new ideas about medicine and mathematics that he shared with the local monastery. These returning crusaders, few as they were, stoked the fires of trade and commerce. The world, once so vast and mysterious, began to feel smaller. The horizons of the possible were expanding with each passing year. But for the common folk of Europe, for Aelric and the people who worked the land, life remained a daily struggle, a constant, attritional battle against hunger, disease, and the vagaries of fate. Even as the great tides of history swept across the continent, the rhythms of peasant life remained largely unchanged, dictated by the turning of the seasons and the demands of the land. Until, that is, the coming of a new, far more intimate and terrifying horseman of the apocalypse, the Black Death. In the 14th century, long after Aelric had grown old and his own son had taken over many of his duties as steward, a new and terrifying threat emerged from the east, a pestilence that would leave no corner of Europe untouched. It began as a rumor, a whisper carried on the trade winds of a strange sickness that struck down young and old, rich and poor alike, leaving entire cities choked with the dead. Aelric, now a man whose face was a map of the passing decades, listened to these tales with a sense of weary dread. When the plague finally arrived in 1347, carried on merchant ships from the Crimea, it spread not like wildfire, but like a flood, an unstoppable tide of death. The disease was borne by fleas on the backs of rats, and it moved with a frightening, silent speed, leaping from port to port, town to town, leaving a trail of absolute devastation in its wake. Panic and despair gripped the populace. The symptoms were the stuff of nightmares, a sudden, raging fever and chills, violent vomiting and diarrhea, and then the telltale swollen, blackened buboes in the armpits and groin that gave the pestilence its name. Most who contracted the disease died within days, their bodies piled in the streets to be collected by the dead carts that rolled through the towns and villages, their drivers calling out, "Bring out your dead!" Aelric's small world was shattered. He watched in horror as friends and neighbors succumbed. Some fled to the countryside, hoping to escape the contagion, but the plague followed them, an invisible stalker, striking down whole families, whole villages. Others turned to superstition and frantic scapegoating, blaming Jews, witches, or other outsiders for the calamity. Many, perhaps most, saw it as a terrible punishment from God, a divine reckoning for the sins of mankind. From the pulpit, the local priest, his face gaunt with fear, railed against the sins of greed, lust, and gluttony, warning of the eternal torments that awaited the unrepentant sinner in the fires of hell. The death toll was staggering, incomprehensible. By the time the first and worst wave had passed, between a third and a half of Europe's entire population had perished. The world Aelric had known his entire life was gone. Fields lay fallow and overgrown with weeds for want of workers to tend them. Entire towns were abandoned, left to the rats and the encroaching wilderness. The social and economic impact was profound and far-reaching. In the plague's grim aftermath, labor, once cheap and plentiful, was suddenly scarce. The few peasants who survived, once bound to the land by an unbreakable feudal order, suddenly found themselves in a position of power. They could demand better wages, more rights, and better conditions from their desperate lords. The old feudal system, which had seemed as permanent as the stars, began to crumble. Serfs and freemen alike sought a better life, leaving the manors for the towns and cities where their labor was most valuable. But the specter of the plague was not so easily banished. It would return in waves for centuries to come, a grim and constant reminder of the fragility of life in the face of an indifferent universe, and of a world that had been changed forever. Even as Europe reeled from the profound devastation of the Black Death, another great and enduring calamity was already looming on the horizon. In the rolling fields of France and the muddy pastures of England, the two great powers became locked in a bitter struggle for supremacy that would consume generations. The 100 Years' War, as it would come to be known, was a conflict born of tangled dynastic ambition and burgeoning national pride. Aelric, now a man with silver hair and grandchildren of his own, experienced this war not as a soldier, but as a constant, wearying presence in the background of his life. It began as a distant dispute over the French crown, with England's King Edward III claiming the throne through his mother's line. But it quickly escalated into a bitter, seemingly endless struggle for territory and influence, as the two kingdoms bled themselves dry for control of the rich lands of Aquitaine and Normandy. For Aelric, the war manifested in the form of higher taxes, in the requisition of grain and livestock from the lands he managed, and in the faces of the young village men conscripted to fight in a foreign land, most of whom would never return. As the morning sun filtered through the narrow window of his now much more comfortable cottage, Aelric would awaken to the familiar sound of a rooster crowing in the distance. The air, cool and crisp, still carried the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. He would stretch his old bones, his body aching not from the previous day's labor, but from the simple weight of his many years. Life as a medieval man, even one who had risen above his station, was never easy, but it was the only life he had ever known. His days, once ruled by the relentless demands of a feudal lord, were now ruled by the familiar rhythms of the seasons and the needs of his own family and the small estate he still helped to manage. He knew himself to be but one small piece in the great, hierarchical puzzle of medieval society, a man still bound by duty and tradition, but a man who had seen the very foundations of that society shaken to its core. He would splash some cold water on his face from a wooden basin and don a simple but well-made woolen tunic. There was no time to linger. Even in old age, there were animals to feed, repairs to be made, and 1,000 other tasks that required his attention. He would break his fast with a humble meal of bread, cheese, and weak ale, staples that had changed little since his boyhood. As he stepped out into the muddy lane that ran through his village, he was greeted by the sights and sounds of daily life in the Middle Ages, a scene that felt both timeless and fragile. The blacksmith's hammer still rang out as he toiled over his anvil, though now he spent more time shaping arrowheads and repairing armor than he did crafting tools and horseshoes for farming. The baker still pulled loaves of bread from his clay oven, their rich aroma wafting through the crisp morning air, a scent of peace amidst rumors of war. Children still darted between the timber-framed houses, laughing and playing with crude wooden toys, their innocence a stark contrast to the grim news of distant battles that arrived with every passing traveler. At the center of the village stood the small stone church, its bell tolling to mark the hours of prayer, a constant, reassuring presence in a world of uncertainty. The church remained the heart of village life, providing not only spiritual guidance but also serving as a place of sanctuary and community gathering. The local priest, one of the few literate people in the village, still served as a conduit to the wider world, reading proclamations from the king and offering prayers for the men fighting across the sea. Beyond the village still lay the strip fields, where Aelric's sons and grandsons now toiled to raise crops for their own sustenance and to pay the rents and tithes to their lord. The work was still backbreaking and seemingly never-ending, but Aelric, watching from the edge of the field, could still see the certain satisfaction in coaxing life from the soil, in watching the crops grow tall and strong under the summer sun. As they worked, the men would exchange news and gossip, talk of the weather, the health of the livestock, the latest demands from the Lord's manor house. In a world where most people still lived and died within a few miles of their birthplace, even small tidbits of information from beyond the village were precious. Life was hard, unyieldingly so, but it was not without its small joys and comforts. In the evenings, Aelric would gather with his sprawling family around the hearth, telling stories and singing songs that had been handed down through generations. On holy days and festivals, there was still music and dancing, a chance for the community to set aside the daily toil and celebrate the turning of the seasons, to forget for a moment the long shadow of the war in France. But even as he went about his daily routines, Aelric could not escape the reminders of the rigid social order that still structured medieval life. Everywhere there were signs of the enduring power and wealth of the nobility and the church, in the grand manor house that loomed on the hill, in the fine clothes and rich foods still enjoyed by the elite, in the deference and respect still demanded by his social betters. And yet, he knew things had changed. He had witnessed it. He had seen the plague loosen the bonds of feudalism, as scarce labor gave peasants like his own family a measure of bargaining power they had never possessed before. He had seen the rise of towns and trade give birth to a new middle class, one that was slowly but surely challenging the traditional hierarchy. Change was no longer a slow, invisible process. It was a force that had ripped through his own life, a storm he had survived. For now, as he watched his grandchildren toil in the fields and live out their lives in the small world of their village, the medieval order remained, bruised and battered, but intact. Their place in it was still largely fixed, their duties and obligations clear. They were still a part of a great chain of being, a link between the soil and the heavens, the temporal and the eternal. But Aelric knew, with a wisdom born of a long and tumultuous life, that the chains were not as strong as they once were, and that the world he would leave behind would be vastly different from the one he had been born into. In the twilight of his life, Aelric found he had become something he never expected: a storyteller. Evenings would find him by the hearth, the firelight dancing across the wrinkled map of his face, surrounded by his grandchildren and other village children. Their eyes, wide with wonder in the flickering gloom, would be fixed on him, and always they clamored for stories, tales of great heroes and powerful saints, of miracles and marvels passed down from generation to generation. In a world where most people still could not read or write, these stories were the very lifeblood of their culture, the invisible threads that bound the community together. Aelric, who had seen so much of the world, was now the keeper of these threads. He would tell them tales of the great King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, defending the realm against the forces of darkness, or of the saintly King Edward the Confessor, who could supposedly cure disease with his holy touch. He spoke of the brave knights who ventured to the Holy Land on crusade, seeking to reclaim Jerusalem for Christendom. These stories offered the children a glimpse of a wider world beyond the confines of their village, a world of high adventure and noble deeds. They were meant to inspire and uplift, to remind them that even the lowliest peasant could aspire to greatness through faith and valor. But Aelric, in his quiet wisdom, knew the stories served another purpose, too. They reinforced the social order and the values that underpinned it. The tales of chivalrous knights and virtuous ladies, of wise kings and holy saints, all served to buttress the great hierarchy of medieval society, to make it seem natural, eternal, and ordained by God himself. And so he told the stories, watching the children absorb their lessons and their morals, knowing they were becoming part of the very fabric of their lives, shaping their understanding of the world and their place within it. But sometimes, as he spoke of a knight's glorious charge, his mind would drift back to the muddy, blood-soaked field at Hastings, to the screams and the terror that the stories always left out. The children saw heroes, he saw ghosts. He never spoke of these things. His own story, the one he had actually lived, was too real, too raw for a bedtime tale. It remained his own, a heavy but precious stone worn smooth by the ceaseless river of his memory. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the timeless rhythms of medieval life continued their eternal cycle around him. The seasons changed from the soft, hopeful greens of spring to the rich, melancholy golds of autumn. Babies were born, their first cries filling the air with new life, and old folks died, their passing marked by the solemn tolling of the church bell. The great wheel of life turned on, indifferent to the kings and wars that marked the calendars of the great. And through it all, the land endured, the fields and forests, the rivers and hills that had sustained generations of peasants like himself. It was a hard life, a life of toil and endless struggle. But as he grew older, Aelric found it was also a life deeply rooted in the soil, in the timeless patterns of nature. In moments of quiet reflection, sitting outside his cottage as the sun set, he would ponder the great mysteries, the questions that have puzzled humanity since the dawn of time. What was the purpose of it all? What, if anything, lay beyond the veil of death? How could one live a good and righteous life in a world so often filled with suffering and injustice? The church offered answers, of course. The priests spoke of the absolute need for faith and obedience, for the quiet acceptance of one's lot in life. They promised the glorious rewards of heaven for those who followed the teachings of Christ. But the heaven they described, a place of golden streets and endless praise, often seemed impossibly far removed from the daily, earthy realities of peasant life. And yet, there was something undeniably comforting in the rituals and rhythms of the church. The solemn mass, the flickering candles, the woody scent of incense, the tolling of the bells that marked the day. In a world that could often seem harsh, chaotic, and unpredictable, the church provided a measure of stability and continuity, a tangible link to a higher power and a greater cosmic purpose. And so Aelric continued on, day by day, season by season, living out his final years in the shadow of the great medieval order he had been born into and had, in his own small way, helped to change. He watched his sons and grandsons take over his duties, passing on the skills and knowledge of his ancestors. He had weathered the great storms of history, conquest, plague, and war. He had seen failed harvests and outbreaks of disease. He had known the petty cruelties of feudal overlords. And through it all, He had held fast to the values that had sustained his people for generations. The values of hard work and perseverance, of loyalty and community, of faith and quiet fortitude. These were the values that had enabled peasants like himself to endure through centuries of hardship, to carve out a life from the stubborn soil of medieval Europe. Finally, the day came when he could no longer rise from his bed. As he lay there, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, their faces etched with a sorrowful love, he could look back on a life well lived. It was a life of humble service and quiet dignity. He had not achieved great fame or fortune. He had not become a knight or a king as he might have dreamed as a boy, but he had played his part. He had added his own small, sturdy thread to the vast and intricate tapestry of medieval life. As he closed his eyes for the final time, he took comfort in the knowledge that the world would go on without him. The fields would still be plowed, the prayers still said, the stories still told, and the songs still sung. For in the end, he understood, it is not the individual that matters, but the community, the great chain of being that links the lowliest peasant to the mightiest king, the living to the dead, the temporal to the eternal. And so he slipped away, his soul winging its way to the great beyond, leaving behind the cares and sorrows of the mortal world. He had lived and loved, struggled and overcome, and now he could rest in the peace of the ages, secure in the knowledge that his life, however humble, had been a part of something greater, a small but vital thread in the vast, unending tapestry of human history. As Aelric's memory fades into the quiet earth, woven into the grand tapestry of history, the world he knew continues its slow, inexorable transformation. The great wheel of time turns, and the focus of our story shifts from the soil to the stone, from the feudal manor to the bustling, ambitious heart of the medieval town. A new kind of person is shaping this changing world, not with a sword or a scepter, but with skilled hands and a keen eye for commerce. The Renaissance is dawning like a slow sunrise, and now, as you lay your weary head down to sleep, imagine that you are a part of this new world. You are a craftsman in a thriving town, a master of your trade, rising with the first light of the sun to begin your day's work. The streets outside your window are already stirring, coming alive with the familiar symphony of urban life. As you make your way to your workshop on the ground floor, the city breathes around you. The baker next door is pulling steaming loaves from his clay oven, the rich, comforting aroma of fresh bread mingling with the sharp, unavoidable stench of the open sewers that run down the center of the street. Hawkers cry their wares in a melodic cacophony, offering fresh fish from the river, ripe cheeses from the countryside, and newly dyed cloth in vibrant, shocking hues. In your workshop, you set to your task, the familiar tools of your trade feeling like an extension of your own hands. You are a creator, perhaps you're a carpenter, your sharp planes and chisels skillfully carving ornate details into sturdy oak furniture, or shaping the massive beams for the new guild hall springing up as the town grows in wealth and confidence. Or maybe you are a blacksmith, your forge already breathing a deep, rhythmic heat as you hammer out tools, horseshoes, and the occasional gleaming sword or polished breastplate for the local lord's men-at-arms. Your craft is your livelihood, your identity, and your profound pride. You learned it from your father, as he did from his, a sacred lineage of skill and knowledge passed down through generations. Your pieces, known for their quality and durability, are sought after in the town market and far beyond. Traveling merchants carry them to distant cities, their value increasing with every mile. A fine table you crafted now graces the great hall of the local manor, a silent testament to your skill standing in the very heart of the old nobility's power. As you work, the vibrant life of the town swirls around your open doorway. The resonant ringing of the great church bells marks the hours of prayer, a constant reminder of God's place and time's passage. A solemn procession of monks from the nearby abbey passes by, their heads bowed, their Latin chants a strange and haunting melody against the backdrop of the city's din. In the town square, a jester in a brightly colored, motley costume entertains a laughing crowd with bawdy jokes and nimble sleight of hand, a splash of chaotic color against the dark timber-framed houses. Occasionally, a wave of genuine excitement ripples through the town. A traveling merchant arrives from Italy or even further afield, his heavy wagons laden with treasures that seem to belong to another world. Exotic spices that sting the nose, gleaming silks that feel like water in the hand, and strange, intricate mechanical devices that whisper of a new kind of knowledge. He brings news, too, of wars in foreign lands, of the latest decadent fashions in the royal court, and, most intriguingly, of a new kind of learning stirring in the great universities, a way of thinking that questions the old truths. Some of these new ideas have begun to trickle down into your own workshop, small cracks in the bedrock of tradition. A wealthy merchant, a man who has traveled widely, commissions a bookcase from you but asks for a classical motif to be carved into the legs, something he saw in a sketch from Florence. A painter friend, a fellow guild member, begins to experiment with the strange new rules of perspective, creating astonishingly lifelike scenes on his wooden panels, images so real you feel you could step right into them. You hear travelers in the tavern speak of incredible water-driven machines they saw in the Arab lands, and the descriptions spark your own imagination, setting your mind to wonder about new ways to power your lathe or bellows. But for the most part, your concerns remain more immediate, more tangible. Will you finish the large order of chairs in time for the annual fair? Will your eldest son, now your apprentice, prove as adept at the craft as you hope, or does his heart lie elsewhere? Will the coin you earn this week be enough to put meat on the table and keep the fire well fed through the coming winter? The rhythms of your days are guided by the demands of your trade, the rules of your guild, and the needs of your family. In the evenings, you gather in the town tavern, a bustling, smoke-filled haven where the day's worries are washed away with a mug of strong ale. You trade stories and news with your fellow craftsmen, complaining about the price of good timber, celebrating a well-earned contract, and gossiping about the affairs of the powerful. Here, the grand concerns of kings and popes seem distant and abstract, though you dutifully pray for their souls in church and pay your tithes without complaint. Your world is here. In this town you have known all your life, a world circumscribed by the work of your hands and the familiar faces of your loved ones. As true night falls, you make your way home through the now quieting streets, the city's chorus fading to a murmur as shutters are drawn and candles are snuffed out one by one. In your small but tidy house above the workshop, you share a simple meal with your family. A thick pottage of vegetables and barley, a substantial hunk of bread from the baker next door, perhaps a bit of cheese or sausage if the week was a good one. You give thanks for the day's blessings, for the skill in your hands, for the steady work, and for the love of your kin. Later, in the quiet darkness of your bedchamber, you reflect on the day and the days to come. Your life is not an easy one. There are always challenges, always uncertainties, but it is a life of tangible purpose and deep-seated pride, a life shaped by the honorable traditions of your craft and the strong bonds of your community. As you drift off to sleep, the soft breathing of your loved ones a gentle rhythm around you. You dream not of battles or of kings, but of the work you will do tomorrow. You dream of the things you will make, the stories you will tell through the grain of the wood or the curve of the metal, the life you will continue to build, one day at a time, in this world that is changing slowly but surely all around you. The great age of knights may be ending, but your age, the age of the Maker, is just beginning. And in this moment there is peace. The peace of a job well done, a family well loved, and a place in the world, however humble, that is yours. The world of the craftsman, with its scent of sawdust and ringing hammers, is one of creation for the body and the home. But another world exists parallel to it, a realm built not of wood and iron, but of stone and spirit, dedicated entirely to the soul and the mind. As the gentle veil of sleep descends upon you, let us delve into this world. Imagine you are a young man named Thomas, not a craftsman or a peasant, but the younger son of a minor noble, and you have chosen a different path. You have entered the imposing gates of a great cathedral, a place that seems to reach to the very heavens, a testament in soaring stone to the unshakable power and influence of the church in this age. You are a novice, a beginner, and this is to be your new life. As you step inside for the first time, the chaotic bustle of the outside world simply fades away, replaced by an ethereal, echoing stillness that feels heavy with the weight of centuries. The air is thick with the sweet, cloying scent of incense and the wax of 1,000 burning candles. Light does not merely enter this place. It is transformed. It filters through vast, intricate stained glass windows, painting the cold stone floor in a kaleidoscope of vibrant, shifting colors, telling silent stories of saints and martyrs in ruby red and sapphire blue. This is more than just a place of worship. It is the beating heart of the entire community, and you are now part of its inner workings. The cathedral serves not only as a spiritual center, but also as a hub of learning, a dispenser of charity, and even a place of quiet commerce. In the great nave, you see the poor and the sick lining up for alms, receiving bread and coin from the church's vast coffers. In the cloistered gardens, you see young scholars, sons of nobles like yourself, poring over precious manuscripts, absorbing the wisdom of the ancients under the watchful eye of a master. Your life as a monk is one of simplicity, devotion, and an unyielding routine. You begin each day long before dawn, awakened by the solemn bells, and make your way to the chapel, kneeling on the cold stone floor as the first mass, matins, is sung. The voices of your fellow monks rise in the ancient, haunting melodies of Gregorian chant, the Latin words echoing off the vaulted ceilings and seeming to hang in the chilled air. After Mass, you break your fast with a simple, silent meal of coarse bread and weak ale in the refectory. The fare is plain but nourishing, designed to sustain the body for work and prayer without ever indulging the senses. Gluttony is a sin, and you are here to lead a life of asceticism and self-denial. With breakfast done, you head to the scriptorium, the quiet, sunlit room where the monastery's most precious treasures are kept and created. Its books and manuscripts. Here, monks like you spend their long days painstakingly copying texts by hand, preserving the knowledge of the past and the teachings of the church for generations yet to come. It is slow, exacting, mind-numbing work, requiring immense patience and a steady hand. You settle at your slanted wooden desk, take up your sharpened quill, dip it in the dark ink, and begin to write, carefully forming each letter on the smooth, expensive parchment before you. The scriptorium is almost entirely silent, save for the unified, gentle scratching of dozens of quills and the occasional soft cough or the shuffle of sandaled feet. As you work, your mind immerses itself in the text. Today, you are copying a section of the great masterwork by the philosopher and theologian Thomas Aquinas, his Summa Theologica. You grapple with his breathtakingly logical arguments, his attempt to build a bridge between the truths of Christian faith and the rational philosophy of the newly rediscovered Aristotle. Aquinas argues that faith and reason are not enemies, but two different paths leading to the same divine truth. The study of nature, the use of logic, these are not threats to faith, but ways of more fully understanding God's magnificent creation. These ideas are profound, revolutionary even. They challenge you, forcing you to think in new ways. But they are not the only powerful ideas that find their way into the monastery walls. One afternoon, a visitor arrives, a Franciscan friar, his robes ragged and dusty from the road, his feet bare. He is nothing like the powerful, land-owning Benedictine abbots you are used to. He follows the teachings of Francis of Assisi, a man who renounced a life of wealth to embrace a vow of absolute poverty, dedicating himself to simplicity, service, and a gospel of radical love and compassion. This friar speaks not of complex theology, but of the divinity found in all of creation. He tells the story of how Francis tamed a wolf that was terrorizing a village, seeing it not as a beast, but as a brother. He sings hymns to the sun and the moon, praising them as God's own handiwork. This visiting friar embodies a different model of spirituality, one based on humility, charity, and a direct, emotional connection to God, and it stands in stark contrast to the intellectual rigor and immense wealth of your own abbey. His presence is a quiet challenge, a source of intense discussion among the other novices. In the gardens, you debate these new ideas. Is the path to God through the mind, through the great logical proofs of Aquinas? Or is it through the heart, through the radical empathy of Francis? Your studies are a constant source of such tension. You hear whispers of another, more controversial thinker, an English Franciscan named Roger Bacon, a man who argues for the importance of empirical observation, of experimentation, a man some call a dangerous radical, even a sorcerer. The church, you learn, is not a monolith. It is a vast, complex ecosystem of competing ideas and spiritual paths. It is a source of profound comfort, but also of deep-seated fear and superstition. From the pulpit in the great nave, you hear guest preachers rail against sin and heresy, threatening eternal damnation in the fires of hell for those who stray from established doctrine. The promise of salvation, in an age so frequently visited by plague and war, is a powerful tool of control. As you watch your abbot engage in politics, advising the very lords who grant the monastery its vast lands, you see how the line between the sacred and the secular is not just blurry, but actively and strategically manipulated. And so your life continues, a ceaseless round of prayer, work, and contemplation, a journey of both the mind and the spirit. It is a hard life, one of discipline and sacrifice, but it is also a life of profound purpose and spiritual fulfillment, a haven of peace and stability in the turbulent sea of the Middle Ages. While the monk seeks God in the quiet solitude of his cell, and the craftsman finds purpose in the bustling energy of his workshop, another figure looms largest in the medieval imagination, a figure of gleaming steel, galloping destriers, and sworn oaths. This is the knight. His world is one of honor and violence, of courtly love and brutal warfare, a world of dazzling contradictions. As you slip deeper into your medieval slumber, imagine you are a boy named Hugh, no older than 10, and you have just taken your first steps into this very world. You are a page, sent from your family's modest estate to serve in the household of a great lord, with the distant, almost impossible dream of one day becoming a knight yourself. Born into the nobility, the knight is a warrior, a servant of his lord, and meant to be a paragon of chivalric virtue. Your life is now dedicated to learning this path from the ground up. Your days are a whirlwind of duties. You run messages through the castle's winding corridors, serve the lord and lady at their high table in the great hall, and learn to care for the priceless war horses in the stables. But your most important task is to serve a specific knight, Sir William, a man renowned throughout the kingdom for his prowess in tournaments and his unwavering loyalty to the king. It is from him you learn the true meaning of service. He teaches you how to clean and polish armor until it shines like a mirror, how to handle a hawk for the hunt, and how to play chess for the mind. From a young age, you are being trained in the arts of war, in swordsmanship, horsemanship, and the complex code of honor that is meant to set a knight apart from a common soldier. You watch the older squires with envy as they train in the yard, their wooden swords clashing, their bodies already hardening for the rigors of battle. You learn to fight with a small lance and a wooden shield, to bear the weight of a miniature mail coat, and most importantly, to face your duties with courage and resolve. For any failure brings shame not just upon you, but upon your master. But the knight is more than just a warrior. He is a living symbol of the feudal order, the physical embodiment of the values and ideals of medieval society. You are taught the code of chivalry relentlessly. A knight is sworn to defend the weak and the powerless, to honor his word as if it were a sacred vow, to serve his lord with unquestioning loyalty and devotion, and to show piety and reverence to God and his church. In times of peace, this code is put on glorious display in the tournament. You remember the first great tournament you witnessed. The field was a sea of colorful pavilions, of fluttering banners bearing the crests of 100 noble houses. The air hummed with excitement, the sound of trumpets, and the voices of heralds proclaiming the names and deeds of the challengers. You helped Sir William into his heavy, ornate armor, piece by painstaking piece, your small hands fumbling with the leather straps. He was competing not just for a prize, but for honor, and for the favor of a particular lady of the court, whose silk scarf he tied to his lance. You watched from the sidelines, your heart pounding, as he rode into the lists, his armor gleaming in the sun. You saw the thunderous charge, the explosive splintering of lances on shields, and heard the roar of the crowd as he unhorsed one opponent after another. This was glory. This was the romance of chivalry made real. This romantic ideal was nurtured in the very heart of the court, often presided over by a powerful and cultured queen. The lady of your castle was a great patron of the arts, a woman whose influence shaped the very culture of chivalry. She encouraged the knights to be more than just warriors. They were to be poets and musicians, to court noble ladies with songs and verses, striving to embody the courtly love ideal of the chaste, devoted, and faithful servant. Sir William, for all his martial strength, would spend hours composing poetry in her honor, a pursuit that seemed to you as difficult and demanding as any joust. The court was a world of refined manners, elegant dances, and whispered political intrigues, a delicate and dangerous game that knights had to navigate with as much skill as they did a battlefield. But you soon learned that the life of a knight was not all glory and romance. The tournament was a game, war was not. Your first true campaign was a brutal awakening. Gone were the colorful pavilions and cheering crowds. They were replaced by endless, grueling marches in the rain and mud, the constant ache of hunger, and the ever-present risk of sickness and death. You saw firsthand that the true business of a knight was not unhorsing his peers for sport, but cutting down desperate, poorly armed foot soldiers in the grim calculus of battle. You saw the ideals of chivalry evaporate in the heat of a skirmish, where survival, not honor, was the only prize. You saw Sir William, your noble paragon of virtue, make ruthless decisions, sacrificing men to gain a strategic advantage, his face a mask of grim determination. And you saw the aftermath, the festering wounds, the cries of the dying, the cold, stark reality of what it meant to be a professional warrior. The beautiful armor was no defense against disease, and a noble life could be snuffed out as quickly as a peasant's. As the years passed and you grew into a squire yourself, you saw the other side of Sir William's life. He was not just a champion and a soldier, but a skilled diplomat and a trusted advisor to the king. You stood silently in the corner of great halls as he negotiated treaties, his words as carefully chosen as his sword thrusts. You saw him navigate the treacherous waters of court politics, balancing his loyalty to his king with the competing demands of other powerful nobles. You realized that a knight's greatest strength was not merely his arm, but his mind, his reputation, and the web of alliances he could build and maintain. You came to understand the complex and contradictory nature of knighthood. On the one hand, knights were the embodiment of a high ideal, brave, chivalrous, and devout. But at the same time, they were deeply enmeshed in the brutal realities of a violent world. They were often caught in the endless, bloody cycle of feudal violence and revenge, and the ideals of chivalry were often a thin veneer over a core of pragmatic, often brutal self-interest. As you now prepare Sir William's armor for another day, you do so with a different understanding. You still feel the pride, the loyalty, the belief in the ideal, but you also feel the immense weight of it all. You understand that the gleaming steel is not just a symbol of glory, but a heavy, relentless burden. And the code of chivalry is not a simple set of rules, but a lifelong, often impossible, struggle. We have walked with peasants in the field, with craftsmen in the bustling towns, with monks in their silent cloisters, and with knights on the tournament grounds. But the grand and complex stage of the medieval world was not shaped by men alone. As the gentle veil of sleep descends upon you, let us delve further into the rich tapestry of history, focusing now on one of the most influential and fascinating figures of the time. She was a woman who defied the conventions of her era, who wielded power with a skill that rivaled any king, and whose legacy would shape the course of European history for centuries to come. Her name was Eleanor of Aquitaine. Her story is not one of quiet devotion or humble service. It is an epic of ambition, love, betrayal, and indomitable will. Born in the year 1122 into the wealthy and powerful house of Poitiers, Eleanor's upbringing was anything but typical for a medieval woman. Her grandfather was the famous troubadour William IX, and she grew up not in a stern, militaristic northern court, but immersed in the vibrant, sophisticated arts and culture of southern France. This was the homeland of courtly love, a place where poetry, music, and romance were celebrated. At the age of just 15, a sudden turn of fate saw her inherit the vast and wealthy duchy of Aquitaine, a territory larger and richer than that controlled by the French king himself. This inheritance instantly made her the single most powerful and eligible bride in all of Europe. Her fate was decided swiftly. Soon after, she was wed to Louis VII, the young, pious, and somewhat dour king of France, in a magnificent ceremony that united her vast southern lands with the French crown. As Queen of France, Eleanor brought a dazzling touch of southern refinement to the more austere northern court. She introduced the songs of the troubadours, the complex ideals of courtly love, and a general appreciation for arts and literature that the French court had previously lacked. But Eleanor was no mere decorative consort. She was a formidable political presence from the very beginning, known for her sharp wit, her keen political acumen, and a fierce, unyielding independence that often unsettled her monkish husband and his advisors. Her spirit was too vibrant to be confined by ceremony. In 1147, she did the unthinkable. She insisted on accompanying Louis on the ill-fated Second Crusade to the Holy Land. Not content to remain in the rear, she led her own contingent of knights and vassals from Aquitaine, a veritable army under her personal command, astonishing and scandalizing the other leaders of the crusade. The campaign was a military and logistical disaster, and the extreme hardships of the journey through treacherous Anatolian terrain placed an unbearable strain on the royal marriage. This, coupled with Eleanor's continued failure to produce a male heir for the French throne, led to the inevitable. In 1152, their marriage was annulled. Cast aside by the King of France, Eleanor's story seemed to be over. But in reality, it was just beginning. Just 8 weeks after the annulment, in a brilliant and daring political move, she wed Henry Plantagenet, the young, energetic, and ferociously ambitious Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou. 2 years later, this same man would ascend to the throne of England as King Henry II. Eleanor, the rejected Queen of France, was now the Queen of England. As Henry's queen, she presided over a vast domain and a court renowned for its sophistication, energy, and learning. She was a tireless patron of the arts, a collector of books, and a savvy political operator in her own right. But her marriage to Henry, which had begun with such passion and ambition, proved to be even more tempestuous than her first. Theirs was a clash of two powerful wills, a relationship marred by Henry's notorious infidelities and their own bitter, escalating power struggles. The great love story soured into a rivalry. Eleanor, feeling marginalized and disrespected, channeled her political energies into her children, particularly her sons. She actively and openly supported them in their rebellions against their own father, a shocking act of defiance against her husband and king. But this time she had overplayed her hand. In 1173, after her son's rebellion failed, an enraged Henry did what was once unimaginable. He had his own queen arrested and imprisoned. For 16 long and bitter years, Eleanor of Aquitaine, once the most celebrated woman in Europe, remained a captive, moved from one castle prison to another. Yet even in the lonely confines of her captivity, she remained a force to be reckoned with. She refused to be broken. She continued to wield influence through correspondence, her indomitable spirit a constant thorn in Henry's side. Her hopes now rested on her favorite son, the dashing and formidable warrior Richard the Lionheart. Upon Henry's death in 1189, Richard became king, and his first act was to free his mother. Eleanor, now nearly 70 years old, rode out from her prison not as a broken woman, but as a queen restored, her face, as one chronicler wrote, a mask of joy. And in her later years, she entered the most powerful phase of her life. While Richard was away on the Third Crusade, she served as regent of England, skillfully and energetically navigating the treacherous waters of medieval politics. She traveled ceaselessly throughout England and France, shoring up support for her absent son, putting down rebellions, raising the enormous ransom needed for his release when he was captured, and negotiating pivotal alliances, including a crucial treaty with her old rival, Philip Augustus of France. She finally died in 1204 at the astonishing age of 82, having outlived 8 of her 10 children, both of her kingly husbands, and nearly all of her famous contemporaries. Her legacy was immense. Through her children, she was the ancestor of both the English and French royal lines for generations to come. But more than that, Eleanor represented a new kind of queenship, one that was not merely ceremonial or passive, but actively and fiercely engaged in the political, military, and cultural life of the realm. She challenged the narrow confines of a woman's role in medieval society, proving that a queen could be a patron, a politician, a warrior, and a true power in her own right. Her extraordinary life is a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit to overcome adversity, to create beauty in the midst of brutality, and to leave a lasting, indelible mark on the world. We have walked the hallowed halls of Chartres and stood in the shadow of Queen Eleanor's ambition. But before the great cathedrals ever touched the sky, before the ideals of chivalry were first sung by the troubadours of Aquitaine, Europe lay fractured, a land of shadows and ghosts left behind by the collapse of the Roman Empire. The great Roman roads were crumbling, its libraries lost to fire and neglect, its unified law replaced by the disparate customs of warring tribes. It was a time of immense uncertainty and violence. But even in the darkest of times, a single, powerful flame can arise to illuminate the world, forging order from chaos. As you drift now on the deep currents of sleep, let us turn our attention to one such flame, to a man who rose from the turmoil to become the most powerful ruler in Europe, a man who would become a myth in his own lifetime. His name was Charlemagne, Charles the Great, and his story is one of audacious ambition, relentless conquest, and the forging of an empire that would lay the very foundations for the modern nations of Europe. Charlemagne was born in the year 742 into a noble family of the Franks, a powerful Germanic people who had settled in the lands of modern-day France and Germany. His father, Pepin the Short, was the first of the ambitious Carolingian dynasty to rule as king of the Franks, and upon his death in 768 he passed his crown and his kingdom jointly to his two sons, Charlemagne and his brother, Carloman. But Charlemagne was not a man content to share power. He was possessed of a towering ambition, a vision of a new, united Christian empire, a restored Roman authority stretching across the continent under his sole command. The joint rule was fraught with tension and rivalry. And so, when Carloman died suddenly and unexpectedly just a few years into their reign, Charlemagne wasted no time. He moved with swift and decisive force, brushing aside the claims of his infant nephews and seizing sole rulership of the entire Frankish kingdom. The path to his vision was now clear. With a powerful and fiercely loyal army at his command, an army he would lead personally for over 3 decades, Charlemagne set out to expand his territories and bring the disparate peoples of Europe under his sway by persuasion if possible, but by the sword if necessary. He led his troops on a relentless series of successful and often brutal campaigns. He swept down into Italy to conquer the Lombards, declaring himself their king. He pushed deep into Spain to battle the Moors. He crushed the Avars in the east, a nomadic people from the steppes, seizing their legendary hoard of treasure. But his most protracted and savage conflict was the subjugation of the Saxons in Germany, a brutal war that raged for more than 30 years. As his empire grew, so too did Charlemagne's reputation as a peerless warrior and a truly great leader. He was known for his astonishing physical presence and his personal bravery on the battlefield, often fighting alongside his men in the thick of the action, his imposing figure and fierce determination inspiring them to victory. He was also a shrewd and calculating politician, forging strategic alliances, using diplomacy and the threat of his armies to extend his influence far beyond the borders of his own kingdom. Under his rule, the Frankish Empire reached its greatest extent, a vast territory stretching from the stormy Atlantic coast of France to the borders of modern-day Hungary and Croatia, from the North Sea down to Rome itself. To govern this immense and diverse realm, he established a system of administration that would serve as a model for centuries to come. He created a centralized bureaucracy, standardized laws and coinage to encourage trade, and divided his empire into counties overseen by a network of loyal nobles or counts who were responsible for maintaining order and collecting taxes. Yet perhaps Charlemagne's greatest and most enduring legacy was not one on the battlefield. It was his role in the deliberate preservation and aggressive promotion of learning and culture, an effort so profound it is now known as the Carolingian Renaissance. In an age of widespread illiteracy, Charlemagne, though likely unable to write himself, was a passionate patron of the arts and sciences. He was determined to fight a war not just against rival kingdoms, but against ignorance itself. He gathered the greatest scholars from across Europe, from England, Ireland, Italy, and Spain, to his new capital city of Aachen. There, they embarked on a monumental project to recover, copy, and preserve the great works of classical antiquity and the teachings of the Church Fathers. They translated ancient texts, compiled encyclopedias, and, crucially, developed a new, clear, and uniform script known as Carolingian minuscule, which made manuscripts far easier to read and copy. A revolution in communication that helped fuel the spread of knowledge. His court at Aachen became a vibrant center of intellectual life, and he mandated the establishment of schools at monasteries and cathedrals throughout his empire. This intellectual flowering, this deliberate relighting of the lamps of civilization would have a lasting and incalculable impact on European history, laying the essential groundwork for the later, more famous Renaissance of the 14th and 15th centuries. But the most potent symbol of Charlemagne's immense legacy was yet to come. In the year 800, on Christmas Day, Charlemagne knelt in prayer at the high altar of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. As he rose, Pope Leo III, in a moment of stunning political theater, placed a golden imperial crown on his head. The assembled congregation roared its approval to Charles, the most pious Augustus, crowned by God, the great and peace-giving emperor of the Romans, life and victory. This coronation was a momentous event, an act of breathtaking historical significance. It marked the first time since the fall of the Western Roman Empire over 3 centuries earlier that a ruler had claimed the title of emperor in Western Europe. It was a powerful statement of Charlemagne's unparalleled authority and prestige, a formal recognition of his role as the defender of the Christian faith and the true successor to the Caesars. It was the symbolic fusion of the 3 great pillars of the new Europe: the heritage of Rome, the vitality of the Germanic peoples, and the unifying faith of the Christian Church. Of course, the reality of Charlemagne's empire was far from the idealized vision of a united, peaceful Christian realm. His conquests were extraordinarily brutal, and his efforts to impose his will and his religion on the various peoples of Europe were often met with fierce resistance and bloody rebellion. And the magnificent empire he built, so reliant on his own personal charisma and relentless energy, would not long survive his death in 814. His successors would struggle to maintain control, and the vast, disparate territories he had brought together would soon fracture into the separate kingdoms that would eventually become the nations of modern Europe. But despite the challenges he faced and the eventual dissolution of his empire, there is no denying the immense, foundational impact that Charlemagne had on the course of history. He was a towering figure who left an indelible mark on the medieval world, a man who ended the chaos of the Dark Ages and personally shaped Europe's politics, culture, and religion in ways that would resonate for 1,000 years. His story is one of hope and inspiration, of the indomitable human spirit that refuses to be bound by the limitations of the present, but instead reaches ever upward toward the infinite possibilities of the future. And so, our long and winding journey through the medieval world, a journey we have taken together, now approaches its end. As the first, brilliant dawn of the Renaissance brightens the distant horizon, the world we have explored in such intimate detail begins to fade, receding into the soft mists of history. But before we bid it a final farewell, let us linger here a moment longer. Let us be like a traveler who, having crossed a vast and varied continent, turns back one last time to savor the view, to commit the landscape of the past to memory. In the dying light of the Middle Ages, we see a world that has become both familiar and yet remains profoundly strange, a distant mirror that reflects our own modern hopes, our fears, and our dreams, but does so in a language that is hauntingly, beautifully different. The clatter of hooves on cobblestones, the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the solemn tolling of the church bells, these were the sounds that marked the very rhythm of daily existence. A symphony we can still almost hear if we listen closely in the quiet of the night. For the vast majority of the people we have met on our journey, life was an unending struggle against the elements, a constant war against hunger and the ever-present specter of disease. We have walked with Aelric in the field, our backs aching in sympathy with his toil. We have stood with the craftsman in his workshop, our hands feeling the phantom texture of the wood and the heat of the forge. We have knelt with the novice monk on the cold stone floors and ridden with the young squire into the terrifying chaos of battle. Their lives were so often defined by hardship, their horizons frequently limited to the village or town of their birth. But even in the midst of this relentless struggle, there was community. There were the powerful, invisible bonds of family, of shared labor, and of a shared, unquestioning faith that wove people together into a resilient whole. We can almost feel the warmth of the hearth fire in the evening as stories were told of brave knights and holy saints, of mischievous spirits and miraculous events. These tales, passed down through the generations, were not mere entertainment. They were comfort, they were wisdom, they were a way of making sense of a world that was often harsh and unforgiving. And what a world it was! It was a place of soaring extremes, of breathtaking beauty, and of grim, unspeakable brutality. The very same society that produced the delicate, lace-like tracery of a Gothic cathedral, a structure that seems to dissolve into pure light and prayer, also bore witness to the grim, methodical horrors of the torture chamber. The noble, chivalric ideals of honor and courtesy, sung by poets and displayed in vibrant tournaments, coexisted with the harsh, grinding realities of feudal oppression and the casual violence of everyday life. It was a world defined by an unshakable belief in hierarchy, a conviction that every person had their God-given place in the great chain of being. The king sat at the apex, ruling by divine right, followed in descending order by the great nobles, the clergy, the merchants, and finally the vast peasant base upon which the entire pyramid rested. To question this order was not merely a political act. It was to question the very will of God. But as we have seen, change was coming. Slowly at first, then with the force of a deluge, the forces of transformation were at work. The growth of towns and trade, the silent plague that upended the social order, the spread of learning beyond the monastery walls, the weakening of feudal bonds, all these factors were reshaping society from its very foundations. The old ways were giving way to the new, even if the process would take centuries to fully unfold. The great castles that once dominated the landscape, the very symbols of Norman power that Aelric helped to build, now stand as silent sentinels. Their mighty walls, which once projected absolute authority, now whisper tales to the wind of battles fought long ago, of loves lost, and of secrets kept within their cold stones. The mighty cathedrals, once the beating heart of all medieval life, still reach towards the heavens, their spires a lasting testament to the unshakable faith that sustained our ancestors through the darkest of times. But even as these old structures hold their ground, the seeds of the modern world are already taking root and sprouting all around them. A revolutionary invention, the printing press, is poised to spread knowledge to the masses at a speed that would have seemed like sorcery to the monks in the scriptorium. The great explorers, armed with new maps and new courage, are pushing back the boundaries of the known world, preparing to set sail on voyages that will bring back tales of entirely new continents and peoples. And in the halls of the great universities, the rediscovered wisdom of the ancient Greeks and Romans is mingling with bold new ideas about humanism, science, and the nature of the individual, sparking a renaissance of learning that will irrevocably change the course of human history. As you slip deeper now into the warm, welcoming embrace of sleep, let your mind wander one last time through the winding streets of a medieval town. See the open-air stalls of the market, the vibrant workshops of the craftsman. Hear the distant cries of the street vendors hawking their wares. Smell the pungent, unforgettable mix of spices, wood smoke, leather, and humanity. Imagine yourself as a pilgrim setting out at dawn on a long journey to some distant holy shrine, your footsteps echoing on the cobblestones as you pass through the great gates of the city and into the wide, unknown world beyond. Let the faces of the people we have met flash before your mind's eye. The humble peasant, the proud knight, the pious monk, the ambitious queen, the visionary emperor. Each of them a single, vital thread in the great tapestry of medieval life, woven together into a story that echoes down to us through the ages. But perhaps the greatest wonder of the Middle Ages is not found in the grand deeds of kings and queens, nor in the towering achievements of art and architecture, but in the simple, everyday moments that make up the true fabric of human existence. The laughter of children playing in a sunlit field, the comfort of a warm fire on a cold winter's night, the joy of a bountiful harvest, the sorrow of a loved one lost. These are the timeless experiences that connect us to them across the centuries. These are the universal truths that remind us of our shared, fragile, and resilient humanity. And so, as you slip deeper and deeper into the warm, weightless, and welcoming embrace of sleep, let the medieval world, in all its richness and complexity, become a comfort and a companion to you. Let its myriad stories and its profound secrets whisper to you now in your dreams, not as jarring events, but as the soft, murmuring currents of a deep and ancient river gently carrying you toward the ocean of slumber. Let these echoes of the past serve as a reminder of the great, unbreakable chain of history that binds all of us together, a chain forged in the fires of conquest, cooled in the waters of faith, and polished by the hands of countless, forgotten generations. When you wake in the morning, refreshed and renewed, carry a small, precious piece of that world with you. Let it be a quiet talisman against the relentless noise and ceaseless trials of modern life. For in the end, the true legacy of the Middle Ages is not found in the cold stones of its castles and cathedrals, not in the gilded crowns of its kings and queens, not even in the grim chronicles of its wars and plagues. No, the true legacy is the enduring, unconquerable spirit of humanity that shines through it all. It is the unquenchable spark of hope and resilience that we saw in Aelric, a boy who dared to dream beyond his furrowed field. It is the quiet dignity of the craftsman, finding purpose and meaning in the skill of his own hands. It is the fierce, intellectual curiosity of the monk, preserving the light of knowledge in a dark time. It is the flawed but noble striving of the knight, reaching for an ideal of honor in a violent world. It is the indomitable will of the queen, refusing to be silenced or broken. It is the grand, unifying vision of the emperor, attempting to build a better, more orderly world from the ashes of the old one. This spirit has carried our ancestors through the darkest of times, and it is the very same spirit that will continue to guide us, their distant descendants, into the unknown future. So let us now bid a fond, final farewell to the medieval world. But let us never forget its lessons, its wonders, its triumphs, and its sorrows. Let it be a constant reminder to us of how far we have come and how much further we still have to go on our own collective journey. And above all, let it be an endless wellspring of stories and dreams, a source of inspiration and wonder that will nourish our souls for all the generations to come. And with that, my dear listener, it is time for us to part ways. Our long journey together through the mists of history has reached its destination. But before I go, before the final curtain of sleep descends, let me leave you with one final thought. In this fast-paced, ever-changing world of ours, a world of fleeting images and instant notifications, it is all too easy to forget the simple, profound joys and the quiet, enduring beauties that surround us every single day. So I invite you, whenever you can, to take a moment. Stop what you are doing, lift your eyes from your screen, and simply marvel at the world around you. Gaze up at the vast, star-strewn sky and feel your own smallness in the face of the cosmos, just as the medieval peasant did. Listen to the intricate song of a bird in the morning, a melody as old as time itself. Feel the simple, honest warmth of the sun on your face, a blessing that connects you to every human who has ever lived. For in those quiet, deliberate moments of wonder, you are connected to something far greater than yourself. You are connected to the vast and wondrous tapestry of life that stretches out across the ages, a tapestry in which your own life is a unique and irreplaceable thread. If you have enjoyed our journey through the medieval world, if it has brought you even a fleeting moment of peace, of wonder, or of inspiration, then my purpose has been fulfilled. For there are still so many stories left to tell, so many lost worlds left to discover, so many echoes of the past waiting to be heard. But for now, my friend, it is time to rest. It is time to let the cares of your day, the worries of your world, fade away like footsteps in the sand. Let the gentle rhythms of your own breathing carry you off to a world of dreams, a world of perfect peace and limitless possibility. May you wake in the morning with a heart full of hope, a mind full of wonder, and a soul ready to embrace all the beauty and mystery that your own life has to offer. Good night, my dear listener. Good night, my fellow traveler through time. May your dreams be filled with the wonders of the ages, with the courage and resilience of the human spirit that has endured through every trial and tribulation. May you wake refreshed and renewed, ready to face the challenges of your own time with the same grace and fortitude as those who came before you. And may you always, always remember that no matter how small or insignificant you may sometimes feel in the grand sweep of things, you are a part of something greater, a vital link in the great chain of being that connects us all across the ages and across the world. Sleep now. Sleep well, and may the peace of centuries past enfold you. May the hope of centuries yet to come inspire you. And may the love that binds us all across all times and all places forever and ever light your way.